You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This has been a plot, in many cases hidden from view, and that people in both parties have participated in, by the way, for different reasons, to collude to concentrate power in the hands of one person.
Pleased to welcome David Sirota on the show. Almost needs no introduction, but your podcast right now that I know is The Lever, you have a particular podcast series within that you'd like people to visit.
Yes, it's called Master Plan. It's actually season 2 of Master Plan. Master Plan season 1 traced the secret 50-year history of the plot to legalize corruption in America. Season 2 is just out. It's called The Kingmakers. It's about the hidden plot to turn the president into a king. Basically, the idea being that if you think Donald Trump was the one who turned the presidency into a monarchy, think again. It's more of a culmination, or I guess coronation, of presidential powers that he is using, but that were created over many, many years by, in many cases, figures in both parties.
It's a great topic, and I recommend everyone go over there. This program, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, started during a different president. If I talked about a president that treated the press badly, called a member of the press an a-hole, only lightly apologized for it, undermined the cabinet on a regular basis, sent non-citizens on planes to get waterboarded and tortured, intimidated intelligence agency. This is a really big one. Intimidated intelligence agencies till they bent to his will, and tried to steer money from government funds to religious institutions, from Social Security to private firms, created fake sources for news reporters to pick up on, and then talked off the record, and then cited the news coverage in making decisions, enlarged presidential power generally, and advocated for less checks on the presidency. And when asked, said, I didn't do a single thing wrong. I really didn't do a single thing wrong. People would tell me, Bruce, do you have TDS? Stop beating up on Donald Trump all the time. And I would have to tell them, sadly, I'm talking about a president that was in office 20 years ago and when this program started, which was George W. Bush. And while I do see some differences, you certainly see a lot of tenets for executive power in that particular presidency. And it wasn't like we held a great reconciliation hearing, or we made a huge bunch of acts passed Congress limiting executive power after that. If it happened, I wasn't quite aware of it. So that's where I start.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring it up, because I think the Bush presidency has been largely memory hold, which is, I think, is strange for people of our age. I was working on Capitol Hill during and after 9/11. I was working on the House Appropriations Committee, where the Department of Homeland Security reorganization happened. So I was right there when a lot of the power was consolidated in the White House. A lot of the plans that had been set in motion beforehand in the Reagan administration, they were spring-loaded to be put into action right after 9/11 by Dick Cheney, who had been waiting there waiting in Washington for decades to try to implement the policies that he had wanted to concentrate power in the executive branch. So in a sense, the Bush presidency was the first culmination of what had been known back then as the unitary executive theory. And now we are, of course, seeing the powers that were concentrated in the White House by Bush and Cheney now be used and abused by Donald Trump.
Let's talk. Well, we might as well just talk about the unitary executive theory and in its essence, if we look at it linguistically, it's okay. There's one president, so only one person can act, and therefore the president must be allowed to act as a person and do all the things that a person can do and have freedom of motion. And now my understanding of the unitary executive theory, and I've talked about it on here, is that decision in Morrison versus Olson, which was a decision against this theory, but you have a lone dissent from Antonin Scalia. I mean, 7-1, which usually means your theory's wacky, unless we're talking about civil rights or something. Usually means that you're wrong. 7-1, including conservatives on the court, and yet Scalia's dissent keeps coming up and up. And I forget the order of things, but either Morrison or Olson was a prosecutor appointed by Congress.
That's right.
And they said essentially can't have a prosecutor because a prosecutorial function can only be the president.
That's right.
This will be great if the Supreme Court ever has to influence a decision. My side note, because they'll say only the president can have an army. Only the president can utilize the armed forces or command them to do anything. And you just see how many ways this theory can go awry. But that's my sense of it. What's your take on unitary executive?
So what you see and what you'll hear about in our podcast series is when Ronald Reagan comes in, he brought with him a lot of young lawyers who had grown up under the backlash to Watergate. So Watergate was seen as an overreach of presidential power. And in the mid-1970s, there were many efforts to constrain presidential power, which people like Dick Cheney and other young conservatives hated. And you see that in their legal writings, in their memos at the time. Reagan gets into office, and a lot of these young lawyers are then in the Reagan administration trying to take a broad view of executive power under the statutes that Congress had already passed. There's memos from John Roberts, from Sam Alito, John Bolton, Ted Olson, who we will get to in a second, essentially saying, taking a broad view of executive power within the confines of the laws that Congress had written. Laws about executive privilege, laws about war-making powers, laws about who could be hired and fired. And they ended up coming up against the limits of broad views on executive power only through the prism of congressionally passed statutes. And so they began cooking up an idea that actually they didn't have to play by those statutory rules at all, that there was a constitutional argument that they had come up with to say that those laws themselves as a whole are unauthorized and unconstitutional under Article 2 of the Constitution, which they interpret to be, and there's only really one line which says the president, executive power shall be vested in a president, as Antonin Scalia ultimately articulated in that Morrison v. Olson ruling. They articulated an argument, they started articulating a constitutional argument that the president could not be constrained in his oversight of the executive branch in any way at all. Ultimately, they start bringing that argument into court. And in the first big case, Morrison v. Olson, which is towards the end of the Iran-Contra affair, and where the Iran-Contra affair dovetails with this is in the independent prosecutor, independent counsel law. Congress, after Watergate, had passed a law saying, listen, when there's credible accusations of high crimes inside of the executive branch cannot investigate itself. The president cannot investigate himself. The president's Justice Department, appointed by the president, cannot investigate the president. Seems to make sense. So in those particular instances, the attorney general can go to a 3-judge panel, and the 3-judge panel can appoint an independent counsel to independently investigate allegations inside of the executive branch without fear that the prosecutor can be fired. This ran into the unitary executive theory, which had said which the argument goes, there can be nothing operating inside of the executive branch that cannot be subject to presidential oversight, control, hiring, and firing. So those two ideas are in conflict, the independent counsel law and the unitary executive theory. They bring that into court, into the Supreme Court. They engineer a case, by the way. Just Ted Olson is one of the conservative lawyers who's for the unitary executive theory. Ted Olson essentially engineers a case. I won't go into the details, but it's about providing documents to Congress. But they basically tee up a case in which a special prosecutor, an independent prosecutor, Morrison, is appointed to investigate the behavior of Ted Olson when he was in the government. It's really a case that Olson and his guys teed up to try to get the independent counsel law overthrown. They bring it into court. They make their unitary executive argument. And you're right, 7-1, the court says, get out of here. The independent counsel law is completely constitutional. Your arguments are ridiculous, except for this dissent from Antonin Scalia. And his dissent becomes famous in conservative circles because it really articulates more expansively the whole unitary executive argument, which at the time seemed fringe, but which over and that was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, over the next 10, 15 years through the war on terror, what seemed fringe from Antonin Scalia becomes the sort of primary foundational legal basis for what the Bush administration does on various issues, from warrantless wiretapping to the torture regime to all sorts of other national security doctrines that were engineered by Bush and just as equally Dick Cheney, who was a very, very strong adherent of the unitary executive theory. So that's a basic overview of what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the contrast points you have with 20 years ago, is where a lot of this was coming from the vice president's office. And not all, particularly at the tail end of the Bush presidency, but he was deferring quite a bit to that. Gosh, you could go back to, there's so many directions. Even if you look at Ford, an increase in executive orders. I could see Cheney and Rumsfeld, who were in that office, chief of staff and defense secretary, trying little ways to get that executive power that they felt they lost with Watergate back on track, and to get him, and their hope was to get him reelected to do that. What we would have saw in a second Ford term might have been a quick line to all of this. The other thing that strikes me is, you take a prosecutor. So a prosecutor investigates. They need subpoena power to investigate. These sound pretty legislative, normal functions to me. And talk about making the president feeble. We've made the Congress feeble over time but first of all, they've done it themselves with some of the statutes ceding so much power to presidents. But also, as you say, you have presidents even want to ignore that and take a basic legislative function. Like, we need someone with subpoena power to go to investigate. There's people who aren't telling the truth. We know it. We think it. Our voters want us to find out, and we want to pass laws to stop it. We need to know. Legislative function. And maybe when it gets to charging, we can refer it to the Justice Department. My third point would be, you think about it in a corporate realm where a lot of these people live their lives, particularly from that side of politics, coming from corporate side. So that's saying the CEO, runs the company. If the board tries to do anything outside of, say, some kind of obscure procedure at a shareholders meeting to get rid of them, if they try in any way to, say, form a committee to provide oversight, form a finance committee to help review the books, oversee a special project, a special series of trips that the CEO has gone on to secure new customers and investigate its purpose, the CEO should be able to just shake them off and say, no, you can't do that. I'm the CEO. And of course, we wouldn't tolerate that in a business setting. And many, many times we claim that, we want to run the country like a business and things like that. So when you look at it from that side, and that how people would understand an executive, someone to do the day-to-day managing, because the board can't sit there every day. Although I have worked for companies where they do seem to get more involved than the Congress does with the president. It just doesn't make, the unitary theory doesn't make any sense. I noticed, for instance, by the way, that John Yoo was recently criticizing the Trump administration over its extreme use of some of these powers, I think related to tariffs, because you're seeing it now in that I take the tariff issue in particular because a broadly unpopular issue probably would not, in my opinion, would not survive a congressional vote. Just the aggressive policy, maybe the 10% might. The aggressive policy wouldn't get through like Republicans like Don Bacon in Nebraska. And so you're using extraordinary powers and using all of these theories and or emergency powers to it's just so contrary to, I think, how it should work that, but again, I go back to, I think you're right. We go back to a bit of Reagan and certainly George W. Bush, where sort of under the threat of a gun with the threat of terrorism on us, a real threat, no doubt, but a lot was used in that name. The authorization for war.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing with Donald Trump is somebody who recognized that there were even the checks on his power that are on paper were not being enforced in any real way by Congress. I mean, this is as much a story, master plan is as much a story about the kingmakers turning the presidency into a king as it is about the Congress allowing that to happen, right? I mean, you talk about tariffs, great example. Donald Trump was trying to rely on legislation that Congress had passed, granting the president broad emergency powers over vast swaths of policy that previously had not been simply handed over to the president. Now, the Supreme Court on the tariff situation ultimately intervened and said that he had too broad a reading. There was a line in there that it said something about economic policy, and Trump had extrapolated it to be tariffs in specific, even though tariffs obviously are actually mentioned in the Constitution. But the point is that Congress, in deferring so much power or granting so much power to the president and deferring so much to the executive branch, had created the conditions for Donald Trump to do something like that and still even have a legal argument. And I think then you take that across the board and you look at the law, at what Donald Trump is doing and the laws that he is citing, and you see that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, Congress has been giving more and more of its power to the executive branch. Now, there's always been a battle between Congress and the executive branch over who gets to make the calls, right? I mean, that's been ever since we've had a constitution. That's been but where I think the founders got things a little bit wrong. I think they got things right when they developed a constitution whose fundamental premise, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, what's your politics, I think we can all agree that the foundational principle in the Constitution is that power is to be dispersed. It is to be a slightly diffuse. It should not be concentrated in the hands of one person. Three branches. I mean, the Constitution lays out different poles of power. The idea being it's not just a king. I think they got that right. Where I think they either got it wrong or our society has changed as such that the presumption was wrong, was that each branch would jealously guard its own powers and authority. Right? Like the Constitution works, I think, to create a balance of power that actually works, countervailing powers, checks and balances, when each of the branches are pretty rigid and assertive about their institution's power. The assumption being that members of Congress in Congress will first and foremost jealously guard their power. Presidents will jealously guard their power. Courts will jealously guard their power. And in that battle, there will be a productive equilibrium. Where I think that assumption broke down is in the modern current era, where the institution that people in the different branches are most loyal to are not the institution, they're the party. In other words, if you're in Congress and you're a Republican, your first loyalty is to the Republican Party as an institution, not to Congress as an institution. And it didn't always used to be like that. I mean, there were back in the 60s and 70s, you would see fights about, Republicans trying to defend the power of Congress, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't think Sam Rayburn spent one moment thinking about what John Kennedy thought about him.
Right.
While he was alive, he would help this. I'll help you, shepherd, if we agree on something. But this is my house. He used to call it my house. And
right.
And that's just one example. I mean, there's so much there. I think that there's pockets of rise in executive power. I think Wilson, as a professor in Princeton, sees a bunch of weak and feeble presidents and then is part of the strategy for pushing for kind of the presidency power project of that time, which the progressives saw as the president as the way to get around corruption, the Budget Act in 1920. You see a lot of movement towards the president there because Congress and state legislatures are so corrupt. So there's a lot there. If you go all the way back to the founding, I of course I agree that it's with a lot of warning signs. They made the best system they can, and this idea that it's a perfect or sacred system. I think for many of them, there's evidence that they wished for future changes to be made. Obviously, Jefferson's the easiest one, who has easy quotes on that. There's the one of the constitutional authoring committees that wrote right on their report, this is constitutional law. It's supposed to be short and sweet, and laws will be made later, but we've turned it into the Bible. I do believe they were aware of changes. I like reading not only the critics. You could read the critics of the Constitution who said, be aware of this president. I have like a couple quotes from Luther Martin, reporting to the Maryland legislature, where he just says, I just came back from this meeting and they got it all wrong, made the president too powerful, never going to be able to impeach him, which has turned out to be somewhat true, never going to be able to impeach him because he has too many favors. You get the consent of the Senate for the appointments, but really, when a president has appointed someone, that's the power, and the consent of the Senate is limited. On that, Luther Martin was almost right. Once in a while, once every 30 years, a presidential appointment gets nixed. But usually, they accept the person's the president and they have a mandate. So a lot of warning signs from people. But also, if you look at the folks who, because let's say if you buy a product and something doesn't work right, you're going to say, well, the salesman told me this, not the critics. You might say, the critics told me not to buy this. But you're going to say, the salesman told me this would work. And so if you look at what the Federalists were arguing at the time, and I was examining a little bit of this today in prep for our conversation, you have like James Iredell, for instance, who's a Federalist, North Carolina. It's a very difficult state, which held back, of course, on the Constitution. So that makes it a key judge. And he's one of the proponents saying, hey, this isn't so bad. For instance, you're going to have, yes, the president has control of the army, but Congress has the ability to declare war. So it's all okay. When you look at that and those type of arguments again and again, a lot of the Federalist arguments these days have been worn out. And all we have is that mostly presidents have been okay people, I guess. A lot of people complained about Roosevelt. I mean, so a lot of these arguments we hear now, just to be fair, boy, I could open up 1930s newspapers and they're talking about his his ability to appoint people, to tell a congressman who may hate the New Deal, like, you don't want to vote against Roosevelt in election, to primary opponents, try to purge opponents, try to go after the Supreme Court. I mean, so you see like a lot of that in FDR. To be fair, although he did get stopped. Ultimately, he got stopped on a lot of those attempts. But yeah, there's certainly been a lot of like ebbs and flows with presidential power. It's just in modern times, executive orders, big increase in those.
When I look at what FDR did, I know that those questions came up. And I would say this, for the most part, it seems to me, and I'm not an FDR scholar, that the vigorous battles between FDR, Congress, and certainly FDR and the courts were battles that were done very much in public, with the public keyed in. And over time, they ultimately forged their own compromises, right? I mean, FDR tries to pack the courts. He actually gets rejected. But in pushing to pack the courts, or to at least change the courts stop becoming the total block on the popular will, aka the New Deal, and start letting what people are voting for become reality. And that took many years. I think that's fundamentally different than, say, Donald Trump waking up one day and deciding to put all sorts of tariffs, customized, bespoke tariffs at different levels on different countries all over the world, deciding to just assert the power to just wake up one day and do that. I think it's different that Donald Trump has launched essentially what could become World War III without a declaration of Congress, without a declaration of war, without authorization from Congress, without really making any kind of public case whatsoever. I mean, I do think that there are historical analogs to presidents fighting for executive power. This, I think, that we're living through is a president taking liberties with executive power that as we show in our series, those liberties were normalized over the course of many years. And I think the question now is, how far does it go? Right? I mean, here we are, a lot of the warnings that were made by people who were eye-rolled, for instance, during the Bush administration. Here we are now living through almost the prophecy of the people who were warning. I mean, we're right now, you and I are talking right now where Congress is considering reauthorizing warrantless surveillance for the Trump administration. Now, this came up, of course, in the Bush administration. Right after 9/11, Bush and Cheney put in place a warrantless wiretapping system that is in, at best, a legal gray area for 6-7 years. They hide it. It leaks out. Ultimately, the Congress, at the end of the Bush administration, with the Bush administration at that point on its outgoing, one of the most unpopular administrations in history, the Democratic Congress signs on to enshrining warrantless wiretapping into law for future presidents. Now, let's be clear. Warrantless wiretapping doesn't say you can't do wiretapping. It says you don't even have to go to a judge to get a warrant. There is no separate branch oversight of that surveillance. And of course, in that law in 2008, they pass a retroactive immunity for the telecom companies, saying anything that you might have done to violate people's civil liberties in the past on this score, people can't sue you, right? And so the critics at the time said, you're giving this to the outgoing Bush administration. Who knows how a future administration is going to use this, right? We had set up the FISA courts, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, back in the mid-'70s after Watergate as a way to create oversight of surveillance. It was designed to prevent stuff like COINTELPRO and the Nixon administration using the intelligence apparatus to spy on political opponents and the like. Like, that was a reform. And now what you're saying is At the end of the Bush administration, we're going to get rid of all those reforms. We're going to enshrine getting rid of all those reforms into law. And now here we are, where the critics who warned about this, many of what they of their predictions have come true. We know that Americans are being swept up in this vast dragnet. We know there have been, including Congress people, including political critics, dissidents, and the like. So we know that that's happening. And yet here we are right now as we speak. And Democrats in Congress are considering joining with Republicans to reauthorize this power for the Trump administration as Stephen Miller demands that reauthorization for their agenda. So the point is, we keep coming up against these points where Congress could claw back some of its power. In this case, claw back some of the power for the judiciary. Again, warrants, right? If you want to do this surveillance, you got to go to a judge and get a warrant. And Congress is still, even at this late hour, still considering just deferring to the king in the White House.
Yeah, I remember when Rush Feingold it was that made this speech about essentially a no kings speech back during the Bush administration. And like you said, I believe the reaction to that largely could be summed up with eye roll. Like, how can you possibly say that? And I think it's helpful to see these long-term tenets in this, because I would almost go as far as to suggest that Donald Trump was always a person who, there was this talk of running for president, 88, he, took out an ad, he went to New Hampshire. He liked the accoutrements of being around the publicity of a campaign, but I doubt that he very much wanted an office that might be complicated, or there's a lot of politics, to deal with. And that's what it was. But after what you had after George W. Bush administration, probably is a more attractive office now to someone like him. Rick Perlstein talks about the invisible bridge between Nixon and Reagan, like where, okay, there wasn't like there was all these meetings and Nixon sort of begat Reagan. In fact, Nixon probably would have liked 10 other people. George W. Bush would probably like 10 other people to be president, including his brother. But there still was this kind of invisible bridge that occurred that sort of loosened things up and made it easy and probably more attractive for someone like him. If the whole usual presidency of you have to persuade Congress, if that's what the big job was, I don't think it's as attractive, as Congress has been largely absent. I've got a few questions from listeners on that. Well, why shouldn't Trump act? Because Congress isn't doing anything. But it appears to me that in some case, at least in the House, Congress isn't moving because they're doing it under the guise of, you're doing a great job, Mr. President. And so there's no reason for us to act.
The thing that I worry about now is when it comes to the Iran war, is that there's an argument that members of Congress in both parties don't actually want to participate in restricting, limiting, or even voting on the war, because that exposes them to accountability. The Iraq war votes ended up being an albatross around the necks of many of the lawmakers who voted for that war. They ended up being held politically accountable in a lot of ways by voters. And so the fear now is that Congress doesn't want to even vote on a declaration of war or a rejection of a declaration of war or using the congressional power of the purse to stop the war, because that would put all of them on record, not just for posterity, but for when they have to go home and try to get reelected. So what I worry is that there's a dynamic in which deferring to the executive is now a way for members of Congress to avoid accountability for themselves. Now, in other words, instead of using their power to hold the executive branch accountable in defense of the institutional prerogatives and constitutional prerogatives of the Congress, they actually are saying, hey, you know what? We found a better idea, a better way to do this. We get reelected to our jobs, our nice, cushy jobs. And we don't have to vote on anything, and nobody can hold us accountable for anything because there's no votes. We're not doing anything.
Right.
I mean,
And
ultimately, the Congress becomes like the Roman Senate, right? It's like a sort of like a vestige that doesn't really do anything.
and that is, I can't even say how far that is from Thomas Paine, from James Madison, from everyone, from all sides now of the constitutional arguments, who wanted that main power source. They could argue about all the limits. They're going to put the Senate and make the Senate the saucer or what have you, give the president power or less power. But they all wanted the House to be the people's voice and to be active, Article 1. And to think about what it really does appear to me to be at least the 2025 plan is just sit. Just sit and do nothing unless you have to. And only now, I knew some things would happen because it's 2026, it's a midterm year, and now there is a little bit more pressure on a congressperson, whether they want this or don't. More than a few of them probably were happy to have the Supreme Court decision on tariffs so that they didn't have to act on it because in their districts, the tariffs at 50% are unpopular, right? I would even argue that enforcement broadly popular, but immigration enforcement at the level of your kid's soccer coach, that's something that would have to be fought for and might not survive. Might survive a House vote. I don't know. That's a little bit stronger issue. We were talking before about how FDR, what he was doing was generally supported by opinion polls or popular votes.
And look, he had huge majorities in Congress. I mean, part of the look, I think part of the premise of the Constitution, one, don't have power all in the hands of one person. Two, the way major decisions get made have to be sold to Congress, AKA, which means that it has to be sold to the public. I think one of the genius premises of the Constitution is that it when it works, it's supposed to force the president to go out and sell his policies to get consent of the people, or at least some consent of the people. The premise being that that's how a stable civilization should operate, right? Where the ruler, if you will, has to constantly go out and solicit the consent of the people. When we end that, when a president doesn't have to go to Congress for a declaration of war to start World War III, when a president doesn't have to go to Congress and sell a proposal for tariffs, and can just wake up and do it himself without any public rationale at all, part of the problem here is not only that it circumvents different constitutional institutions. The deeper problem is that it really does create a king subject situation, right? Where the subjects in the kingdom don't feel like they're participating in the decisions being made in their name, in decisions that are going to affect their lives. And I think the premise there is that's ultimately not sustainable for a civilization. We've seen that story before in human history over and over again, and it almost always does not end well.
I always think people to say, oh, who's worse, Stalin, Hitler, all these things, Pinochet. And I just have come to the conclusion after studying history for so long that it doesn't matter what name you call it. I don't care if it's Huey Long and people might get a health care out of it. I don't care if it's Berlusconi. Anytime you're setting up where the only vote you have is, do you support this person? And that's it. We've lost there. And a republic obviously should be so much more than that. Your point taken on the war vote, where a very scary situation where you had Congress that really wanted to take positions on Vietnam, even on the Gulf War in Iraq. They took those votes, as difficult as they were, even though both President Bushes at their different Gulf wars said, well, I'll ignore the vote if it goes against me. I don't need it. But they did it anyway. They took those votes. You're right that they were used for decades, against the people that voted for them. And And yeah, to have a situation where I don't even not sure I want to do a war of powers because I don't want to say hitting Iran is right and I don't want to say hitting Iran is wrong. That's I do think that the Congress is in the corner a bit. A couple listeners tell me that on this point that they may be seeing it wrong. They may be seeing it not as so much as part of the plan, which I suspect there's a little bit of that just as a natural thing. Well, the president takes over when Congress does nothing. Well, yeah, unless you orchestrate it, and that is hopefully something we got to change.
Well, I mean, and I should say, I do think ultimately, and I wrote a piece about this for The Guardian recently, that ultimately Congress will probably have to vote on whether to fund the war or not. There's a lot of talk about a $200 billion supplemental bill. The money will run out. The Trump administration will need more money to prosecute this war, certainly if it escalates. And so I don't think there's any way that Congress sort of gets out of the way of that. Although you do see some Democrats trying to argue that they can be against the war while funding the war. I feel like that's going to be some sort of rhetorical lane some Democrats are going to try to take. But I think ultimately, in reality here, the one power that Congress has remaining that even unitary executive types will concede is Congress's power of the purse. I mean, it was John Roberts, who's been very supportive of the unitary executive theory, who wrote a memo to Ronald Reagan's when he was in the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House, saying, listen, essentially, look, we can try to do a lot of things, but when it comes to the power of the purse, Congress is supreme, and the Constitution is entirely clear about that. And so I think ultimately, Congress can pass war powers resolutions. It can pass declarations of war or declarations of disapproval of war that are hard to legally enforce. They're important, but hard to legally enforce. What is easy to legally enforce is the actual lifeblood of a war, which is the money. And so ultimately, that vote is where the real power is. That vote is where a congressperson is making a decision on whether to support or not support a war. The power of the purse is the real power here. And so I think as much as many members of Congress may want to not have to vote on any of this, they're going to have to. And that vote, they can try to talk their way around people perceiving that vote as like the vote, but that will be the vote.
Yeah, I think it's always tough. The power of the purse is a tough one because you either restrain it or you don't, right? And it is the one time you probably saw it was, of course, a little too late, right? Is the tail end of the Vietnam War. The Congress was not going to vote for a single thing, because there were attempts to, maybe we want to keep some troops here. Maybe we want to keep, no. They were ready, and they would have popular support. Throughout history, the power of the purse has been tough. Isolationists who had opposed World War II still had to vote for Abraham Lincoln. Famously, still had to vote for the Mexican War. Probably a great example of a president sort of like starting something and then saying, "Now, you Whigs, you must fund it." But because it's a tough vote, because what'll happen too is they'll mix it up and it'll be like, well, don't you want to defend the Gulf nations? This is my understanding of the missiles that are being hurled at some of the Gulf nations are the counter explosives to take those missiles out are very, very expensive. This is part of Iran's defense strategy to use up the money, and so not voting for it. And it will be interesting to see that vote. You do see both sides on this one. This is probably the first war where we don't have a popular run-up, really.
That's right.
That's not what I'm seeing. We have something would have to change for it to become popular. Best you're going to get, don't put our forces in harm's way. And that's the problem with a downvote. In the '02 midterms, I mean, George Bush really used that against congressmen who voted against it. And in '04, there was a television ad of John Kerry showing a soldier's Kevlar disappearing because of his vote. You have things like that they have to be. It'll be a tough vote, but I think people have to look at it objectively. The other thing that I think ends wars, but it's very long usually, is you just open up a torrent of resistance. We're not voting for anything this president wants. I think that's really what they did to Nixon, but they, again, Watergate that had changed the balance, the rare change in balance between Congress.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think if you look in whether it was Vietnam
mm,
or even the Iraq War, or by the way, even the ICE municipal invasions in Minnesota, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Vietnam War and the Paris Accords, for instance, started being forged soon after Congress passed that Church Amendment to say no more funding for military operations in Southeast Asia. I do not think it was a coincidence that after Democrats passed a war funding bill in 2007, 2008 that included a mandated timetable for withdrawal. George Bush vetoed that bill, but I do not think it was a coincidence that the moment Congress finally flashed its power of the purse, that is when Bush began reducing our presence in Iraq. I do not think it was a coincidence that Donald Trump softened slightly and backed off slightly the deployment of ICE into major American cities, although some of it's still happening. I don't think he did that. I don't think it's a coincidence he did that until Congress flashed its power of the purse again, saying we're going to try to cut off some of the funding for ICE. Now, ICE obviously is pre-funded in a lot of ways, but I guess my point is that throughout history we have examples where presidents only start responding when Congress starts invoking or threatening to invoke its one sacrosanct power that is still not in contention, the power of the purse.
absolutely. Great point. Anything that we should have touched on that we didn't right now?
No, I just look. I hope everyone will listen to Master Plan and understand this has been a plot, in many cases hidden from view, and that people in both parties have participated in, for by the way, for different reasons, to collude to concentrate power in the hands of one person. If you went to the No Kings rally, I think it's incumbent on you to understand that what we're dealing with now did not just happen overnight, and it's going to take a while and really concerted, focused effort to wind it back. And part of winding it back is recognizing what has happened, and then encouraging and really holding out members of Congress accountable for what they're doing to either defer more power to the president or take more power back to create more of a balancing. This is not it seems like an esoteric academic situation, but it is far from it. This is like as real as it gets. When a president wakes up in the morning and decides to start World War III and Congress has nothing to say about it, something in your civilization has gone deeply wrong. And so recognizing the roots of what's gone wrong is really important.
Even the 50% tariffs to me were almost a war, like possibly wars often start with trade. You've actually got the European Union completely changing its defense strategy, not just the little percentage increase that America wanted, which might have been reasonable, but to actually start pulling things away and develop their own structures, which will take some time. Total
this
change.
Is all a cautionary tale, whether you're on the right or the left, about maybe we don't want all the power in the hands of one person.
So when it's President Newsom or President Mondami, and I probably mean his wife since he can't be president, we're gonna argue for the same thing.
Yes, and I you're bringing up an important point. And I really want to make clear, my own personal views on this are, on one side, you have right now the current Democratic Party leadership that seems afraid to, when it becomes president, when it has the White House, that often is afraid to use executive power in any kind of aggressive way. On the other side, you have the Republicans who are constantly pushing the envelope with executive power. I don't think it's a tenable situation where every time the Republicans get in power, they maximize and push the envelope on executive power. And then every time the Democrats get into power, they don't use that power in any kind of way at all. Like that's a ratchet effect farther and farther right. I don't think that's good for anyone. I also don't think it means that Democrats have to come in and behave like Donald Trump with executive power. What I'm getting at is that there's a middle ground here. Right there, I would argue that like Democrats can more aggressively use executive power if they take back the White House in a way that doesn't go as far as Donald Trump, but certainly goes a lot farther than their past presidents in the modern era have used that executive power. Two examples, just from the Obama administration, just to give folks an idea of what I'm talking about. One of the most egregious tax loopholes in the entire tax system that somehow has still survived is the tax loophole that allows private equity billionaires to pay a lower effective tax rate than everyone else. It's the old Warren Buffett, called the Warren Buffett tax loophole, because Warren Buffett's written about how he pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. It's because of the way private equity income is classified at the IRS. That can be closed with a new interpretive guidance at the IRS about how to interpret that income. That is well within a president's executive authority. And the Democrats, for instance, refused to use that executive authority to close that loophole at a time that they were complaining about it. They were making a public show of complaining about it, but not using their executive authority to change it. Same thing with dark money. It is well within an executive authority to say that companies, through the SEC, that companies regulated by the SEC have to disclose to shareholders all of their spending on dark money politics. That is well within the SEC's power to do that. And the Democrats did not do that when they had the presidency. The point in bringing up just those two ideas is that there is a middle ground here between a Republican Party that is now starting World War III, waking up in the morning and without any congressional authorization at all, pushing the complete constitutional envelope into unprecedented territory, and Democrats not doing the most minimal things to fulfill their campaign promises within the confines of indisputable executive authority. And so I think the big question for the next Democratic presidency is, are they actually willing to use more of the power in the executive branch to deliver on what they promise? Or are they, if they get back the White House, are they going to use that office to do not much of anything or relinquish their power and not fulfill their promises? To me, that will be like one of the big questions if and when there is a next administration.
Absolutely. Great point. David, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. And everybody go check out his podcast, check out Master Plan, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.